we're back after a week off, and I'm Dave Renz, Director of the Midwest Center for Nonprofit Leadership. I do a lot of the things at the center to work on boards governance, both on the research side and on board development side. And when we were thinking about topics and areas of concern and interest to our community here, we found a pretty obvious sort of suggestion that a couple of people have raised for me, just bringing it up as I hear in my, and by the way, I do, Mark Culver will occasionally post things in chat. I do an hour and a half just drop in Zoom office hours each week. And of course, a lot of times what we're hearing there is about how executives are working with, or sometimes not, their boards, and led us to say, well, how about if we do another little section of this navigation series on boards and governance. So that led us to the next 3 sessions. Today we're in how effective boards support their executives to be well-rounded. However, of course, next week we will do a follow-up session, which is, as executives and staff members, how do we support our boards? Trying to look at this from a partnership perspective both today and next week. The third session, which is slightly, well, it's not slightly, it's related, but it is a little bit different from these two, but it focuses on board members. I guess I could have called it how effective boards support their members, because the issue is board engagement and how do we keep folks in the game. I did a workshop on that once in another city in the country, and I called it, are you a board member or a board member? But that's 2 weeks from now. So today we have a brief, it's our usual format. We will share presentation content for the next 25 to more likely 30 minutes. But as we've started to do a bit more in these sessions in the past few times, we actually encourage you to drop questions into chat, or even if you'd like to just raise the question personally, just put in the chat room that you have a question or comment you'd like to share. Monica and Cindy are monitoring the chat room, and they'll flag when we have somebody wishing to raise a question or share an observation. And, this is not a small group, but the fact of the matter is it's not that hard to engage in interactions. We will have about 20 minutes to 25 minutes to talk, raise questions, and further get into whatever aspects of today's topic you have an interest in. So, I guess it's just music's on my mind these days, so the times they are changing. I thought I might subject you to Bob Dylan, then I thought, no, that at this time of morning, that might not be a good idea. So you got Bill Withers instead. But the times are changing. We'll talk briefly about that. Talk about what executives are experiencing and feeling. And of course, I should say as a matter of observation that runs through this whole session, I'm speaking in generic terms. Obviously, I'm not speaking about any individual organization. I have worked with a fair number of boards in the last, actually 90 days to 4 months during this time. As you can imagine, those interactions were substantially Zoom-based. And so we've had some interesting experiences. The truth is one of my colleagues used to say a long time ago, but it's still true. When you've seen one board, you've seen one board. They are all different. They're all unique. And frankly, it's even more unique and different, positive and potentially negative, when you're talking about relationships. And that's really the core of what we're talking about in these next 2 sessions. The board executive, especially chief executive relationship that's here. So I did just send out a poll to some execs and just said, hey, what are you going through? What are you feeling? And I knew some of them already had some thoughts on this because I've worked with their organizations in other ways. So I want to highlight what I'm hearing and frankly what I'm reading, because there have been a fair number of national surveys that purport to tap into this as well. And then talk about, well, so what are some of the key ways that your board can support your chief executive? And I have sort of 5 categories here, but then we'll go into talking about your strategies, things you've seen work, maybe warnings you have one way or another. So again, we want to be interactive as we go to the second part of our session today. And so please do, flag a question if you've got a question or something that you want to bring up, or if you just have an observation. And I do welcome, we don't just have to gripe about what's not happening. Let's share great things that people are doing. And I do know several executives I've talked with have said they're proud to say they have a relationship with a board that is exhibited by ongoing engagement and care. So, the times there are changing, what a cliche. But of course, it really is, a while back, the cliche phrase was a perfect storm. I think it applies now. If you look at everything that's gone on since January, obviously we got hit with the pandemic that then grew into the economy, the recession, and the things that are going on there. And then we had a further shift with the brutality in Minneapolis and other, really highlighting brutality in many places around the country. We've got civil unrest and change, lots going on. And of course, part of what's so fascinating is that each of these is a huge pressure and force in and of itself, but they're really intersecting. And nonprofits in many ways are, and I don't have to tell you this, you know this, but nonprofits are really at the intersection of these. And candidly, because they're the point person, figuratively, sometimes literally, in the nonprofit organization, executives are right up front. They're in the middle, and frankly, often expected to orchestrate whatever is needed. But we're in such uncharted territory here that it is really, it's really a challenging game. In fact, you cannot plan long term. That, by the way, to me, doesn't mean you don't try to get ready to plan, but to me, that's about developing scenarios. That was a previous session, so I won't go into that. But it is something that that I think we need to think about. But there's the content, the official work, all those kinds of things. I'll be talking about some of that, but what I really want to highlight in today's session is this issue of how are we supporting our executives at a time when it's really tough. There have been a few surveys done in the United States in the last few years highlighting executive directors. I mean, to some extent, the surveys were crepe hangers, because they're saying, hey, executive board relationships are in trouble because executives are preparing to leave. Well, some of them were boomers and they were going to retire. Frankly, they didn't as fast because of the last recession. Now we're in another cycle. But I don't think anyone would dispute the ideal. This little quote is from Board Source, of course, one of their publications. At its best, the board is a partner with the executive is a partner with the board. Executive boards know that they need to be in a partnership with the executive. Neither can be effective or successful in their role if they can't work together effectively as partners. Mutual interdependence is another phrase that comes to mind. And candidly, this part of this, and this is where we need to talk a little bit more today. This partnership really is enabled through trust, candor, respect, and honest communication. But one of the things that I've learned in my career, and I see it exhibited in many different settings, is the reality that under stress, shall we say stress? Under stress, we tend to revert back to our sort of natural, sometimes underdeveloped or prior behaviors. We just kind of, it's what comes naturally, but it may not be what's actually most beneficial and supportive, especially in more complicated relationship kinds of situations such as we have with the executive and the board. So when I've communicated with executives, and as I said a minute ago, I did invite some of the executive directors I've been working with lately to weigh in and just share some of what they're feeling. And candidly, I hope you, and of course, what we have on this call, the Zoom call, is a combination of board members and executives both. So from whatever seat, and by the way, of course, many of you actually live in both those worlds because you're an executive in one organization, you're on or will be on a board in another. But what we're hearing, and today's session is covering things that are important even under, you'll excuse the phrase, but normal circumstances, but anything but normal right now. So executives are really telling us when we get candid information that they really feel caught. There's this myriad of unpredictable sources and forces, and frankly, just about the time you got something figured out, something else shifts or moves. And so it's a very isolating role in a lot of ways. Candidly, again, it is under the best of circumstances, but when we're all sheltering, or most of us are sheltering at home, our workforce is spread out, we're all living and engaging through Zoom and Teams and all the wonderful software that supposedly is going to enhance our productivity, if my computer just didn't crash every time I open Teams, but that's between me and Bill Gates. So what executives are saying, frankly, a fair number of executives are sad, troubled, because they're feeling unappreciated. Candidly, I don't think they are as unappreciated as they feel, because I've interacted with some board leaders on this too, but the board members feel lost. They don't know what to do. And so it's kind of like, well, so that I don't put my foot in my mouth, or so I don't get in the way, I'm going to stay back. Well, so in the absence of contact of any substance, you don't feel appreciated. In fact, you feel lonely, you feel alone. I have talked with a fair number of executives who wonder where their board went, because of course, if you're not meeting in person, if you're not, people aren't logging in, who knows why somebody didn't come to a meeting? Are they not interested? Are they unwilling to support you? Are they in trouble themselves? Is their technology not working? The Zoom system or whatever vehicles, WebEx, CT, or whatever it is that you're using. But executives are feeling lonely. And by the way, I have to say, even if it's not sort of fair in the sense that you put it on a board or other staff and say, hey, this is caused by you, we just need to expect that when people feel troubled, we're going to help them. So they're feeling isolated and disconnected in many regards. Some executives actually feel misunderstood. And candidly, depending on what the nature of the relationship was prior to shifting into the pandemic and recession mode of the last 90 days, you may not have had much of a relationship between the board, or at least some members of the board, and the executive along the way. Unfortunately, one tendency I've seen with a couple of boards, I've seen it handled very well in a couple of others, but a couple of boards are kind of like, oh, geez, this is a terrible time, so now we can't engage in team building. Well, it's not like you can just let it go until there's a better, more convenient or manageable time. And there are ways you can work on team building and growing connectedness through technology and email communications, things like that. It is a critical leadership issue. And so things I'm talking about here today are really important from a board perspective overall, board members and board leaders. And frankly, at risk of sounding rude, when executives can help their board better understand some of these things, that will be helpful as well. But again, to go back to the core point, if you didn't have much of a relationship, and again, that might not have been because of problems, it might have been because I'm working with one board where I think 60% of that board, because of quirks and transitions and departures and illnesses, 60% of that board was brand new. They came in, they never actually had a collective meeting of the new generation of the board before the pandemic hit. And they started, they're sheltering at home. Some people were hunkering down in other ways. And so, again, it's not about judgment. It's just, this is how people are feeling. And frankly, it's really tough. And I worry about the health, the mental health, and ultimately the impact and effectiveness. If organizational health is fundamentally shaped by the effectiveness of the board and executive and the health of that relationship. And for executives who aren't feeling well, literally or figuratively, obviously that can be an issue. A lot of executives, pretty much everybody I'm talking to is stressed. That's pushing some to the edge of burnout. Some of them were even there perhaps a little before the pandemic hit. But the load, trying to figure out, well, how do we stay in the game? How do we serve our clients? All of that is such a significant, critical issue. And 2 months ago, I guess I did a navigation session on supporting our people through change. And there are things, I'm trying not to duplicate what I shared in that session, but if you saw that session, you may recall I like a model that William Bridges uses about transformational change and the human dynamics that people experience. And the critical challenge is when we experience major change, even the ones we want, much less the ones that aren't so great, we experience loss, and that leads us to experience grief. And I'm hearing executives who are doing the best they can right now, but they're also saying to me, this is not what I signed up for. This is tough. And candidly, we need to come back together. One of the insights of the work of change leadership and making your way through transformative and maybe traumatic change is to build on the sense of community. Well, one layer of that community is the board and the executive team, if you're a larger organization, coming together to help make things work and really support each other in that sense. One of the things that I heard from a few of the executives that I invited to tell me what they were feeling and thinking. Nobody expressed it this way, but they felt like no one really understood or empathized with the situation they're in. Again, that happens with executives no matter what. It's a uniquely isolating role because there are, you work closely with your staff, and if you have an executive team with them, but there are things that are just out of bounds you should not be addressing or engaging in any depth with them about. Ideally, that might be with the board, but similarly, the board is not there all the time. If you've got a strong and facilitative chair, that can really make a big difference. But, the chair's job is not to come in and be the executive. Life is pretty ugly usually when chairs drop in and decide to take that role over. So, and role clarity, by the way, is something we'll talk about later because it's so critical. So each nonprofit has its own sets of challenges and problems. It's been interesting during the pandemic to hear folks tell me, a couple of people have said that one part of their organization is swamped. They're just going crazy. They can't keep up with everything, all the work that they have to do, and especially when the Small Business Administration, the PPP loans and all of that were first kicking out. It's kind of like everybody had to shift into high gear who was in the functions that related to that, and yet you had other production functions that maybe stopped completely. You see this particularly in a lot of performing arts organizations where it's kind of like, well, not to pick on them, but or make anything special about them, but I was struck by the fact that Starlight has now said there's no season here. So, the business office has got to operate, but clearly there's no performers on the stage for this coming season. So executives are at the intersection of these things. My pitch, and I want to ask you to think about this, is how we work together to grow a culture of empathy. And by the way, this is two-way empathy. It's for those who are on our boards, who are trapped and challenged with all the things going on in their personal and organizational lives. Hopefully they have the fortune of still having jobs and doing that work, but of course many don't, or at least they're on a furlough, so they're not sure what's happening there. And we need to be empathetic with regard to them, but also trying to grow greater empathy for the exceptional dynamics and pressures the executive is dealing with. So I've highlighted 5 general categories. Again, this is informed by both some national surveys and things that local executives have communicated to me. And I invite you to either elaborate or challenge them as we go through the session here. So I'll go through each of them briefly and just highlight what I think is at the core of these things. The 5 ways, at least perhaps is the way to say it, but if I'd written a list of 50, I would have just scared you and made you tired. Speaking of burnout. But, you know, number 1 on the list is be proactive and reach out, not waiting for the chief executive, the executive director, whatever the title is, to come, you know, to come out to you, to reach out to you, or for that matter, the board chair. I mean, this is something for everybody to think about. The second key way to support folks, and there are several ways that I want to highlight here, is just to, I shouldn't say just to be there. It's to be there, starting with fiduciary duties like the duty of care and showing up, but it goes beyond that. The third of the key ways is that ambassador relationship, positive relationships role in the community, and that's a critical need anytime, but again, especially now. The fourth category, which I would have put here, and it, you know, I'll explain the depth behind it in a minute. It's something that I hadn't heard phrased this way, but I love the phrase. This is, I took this from one of our executives who communicated with me and said, I need my board to be an accountability partner. I thought that was a fascinating way to phrase it, and I loved it. I told people I wouldn't quote them, so I'm not going to quote anybody. If he wants to weigh in and say, hey, that was my phrase, you're certainly welcome to do that. And last but not least, intersecting, I mean, these are not discrete categories, they overlap, because more actively investing in executive growth, health, and resilience is another critical way to support our chief executives and help them deliver the best on behalf of the organization and to our clients. So in the you know, in the category of being proactive and reaching out, I'm probably saying it more often than you want to hear it, but it's actually something that until you've been in the role, you don't actually realize how lonely it can be being in an executive director or key executive role. One of the folks that I communicated with in the last couple of weeks wrote back to me and just said, hey, nonprofit chief executives are people too. And they're experiencing the tensions and the stresses and all the kinds of things that, I mean, insecurities, you know, wouldn't it be great if we had an algorithm for how to move forward from here? But by the way, there's almost nothing of a significant nature that we're doing that there's an algorithm out there for us. So we have to be supporting each other and working with each other. But it starts with just reaching out, you know, reaching out, letting people know you care. A quote from one of the people who wrote to me, it would be nice to receive a simple encouraging note or a call from time to time, from, you know, apart from whatever official activities and engagement you need, like showing up for a board meeting or something like that. I will say that this is an area where I've heard from a number of executives, they weren't necessarily talking about their board being, they weren't responding to a question about, is your board helpful, but they were expressing thankfulness that they had finance people on their boards, sometimes in banks or other financial organizations, who jumped in proactively when the PPP loans came up and things needed to happen very quickly, especially you'll recall that first round when like it all came and went in about a day. And so whether you got in and were equipped to respond was very much a function of the support you had from your executive staff, but also especially in many organizations, their board. So the good news was, and I think there's a hint of significance in this as well, those organizations found people who sometimes didn't say much or do much on the board did reach out. They were paying attention because they reached out when the PPP application stage came up. And frankly, you know, the issue was partly filing the paperwork, but more critical than that was even having a place to go to and starting to connect with a prospective lender in that process. But here's the thing, you know, when you see a need that's out there, and as a member of the board, don't wait for a request, reach out, offer your expertise, ask if it would help. Now, by the way, I don't suggest you drop in and take it over. This is about being respectful, but also helping people understand and know, well, hey, I have some capacity to do this or some basis for helping. Would it be helpful? Can I be of help to you? And frankly, that query to your executive on some occasional basis, is there a way I can be helpful to you? You know, maybe apart from the formal official stuff, although that's important too. We always talk about boards being a critical resource in terms of being a sounding board, but that's really a critical role as well. Just being there to hear and talk about what it is that's going on. And by the way, so the second category is be there, show up. I'm worried that some boards, and I'm not candidly quite sure why, some boards have stopped meeting regularly, and there's no legitimate reason to stop meeting. Now, how you meet and what the nature and form and content of those meetings are is another question. But people have to show up for it to be a meeting, of course. And so showing up, you know, when I read both the national surveys and talk with local executives, one of the sort of pleas I hear fairly regularly is please show up, attend to the meeting, prepare ahead of time, do your homework. Some of these things that we're going through right now are much more significant in the life and health of a nonprofit than things that were going on a year or half a year ago. Connect, but that of course kind of reminds me of explaining participation grades in my classes at UMKC. I grade partly on the basis of participation in the class, and you won't be surprised to hear that my first admonition is strong participation does not equal you talking all the time and more loudly than anybody else. It's a balanced participation. In fact, as quirky as it sounds, I mean, you know this. This is, by the way, you know all this stuff. I'm hoping that this offers a bit of a framework to think about this systematically and ideally to go back to your board and staff and think about how we grow and develop these things. But the reality is showing up, being there, and sometimes being an audience, listening candidly. I mean, be critical when it's warranted, not rude, not disrespectful. But at the same time, how can I balance? How can I support this? And I will say a few executives who communicated with me directly did say, you know, in the era of Zoom, where sometimes we have these technical disjunctures, people don't hear that somebody else started and they just kind of talk over them and people are talking with each other and all of that. Actively think about sharing the microphone or the Zoom screen and work on actively listening. And of course, one of the things that's a real issue is when you've committed to doing something, follow through and deliver, or if life really has thrown you a curve and you can't follow through on whatever it is that's needed, let the board chair, the executive director, whomever is appropriate, know, hey, this has come up. I can't work on this, because there's inevitably in board work, there are multiple people whose tasks connect with each other. And if somebody just disappears on you, I mean, obviously, if you get seriously ill and you just have to drop out, you know, that happens. Although even there, helping people know what's going on and delivering or keeping in touch is the critical point and issue there. So the third of the categories that has come up in a few different ways is that of being an ambassador, you know, being out there on behalf of the organization. This is a very isolating time, and it's kind of funny. I'm sure you're feeling this, and of course we're, you know, imposing upon your time again this morning through a Zoom call. But you know, how is it that we can feel so isolated when we're staring at Zoom screens day in and day out for so much of every day? But it is isolating unless we go to the additional effort to add relationship dimensions and also use some of the other tools that are at our disposal. A few of the executives that I've communicated with have said, you know, even just having board members actively show support for the organization. And I will admit I'm not great on this because I don't think in terms of social media. I'm not wired that way. I grew up when dinosaurs were not texting each other or tweeting each other. And yet, in today's social media world, liking video, agencies are still doing work, perhaps more than ever, digitally, on the screen, on websites, in social media. So chiming in, and that ambassador role includes helping the organization network. Well, in the digital environment of today, liking things, passing, reposting, stuff like that, helps expand the network of the agency, and you're able, without a huge amount of work, to help expand the impact, awareness, understanding of the agency and what's going on in your organization. Sometimes this has happened exceptionally well. By the way, the earlier image of show up, be there, does include, unfortunately, what is a challenge for, and just disliked for, a fair number of board members. Participate in and show your support, even by just being there, for fundraising or other significant events of the organization. We've had some phenomenal success stories in the region of agencies who shifted their fundraising big event of the year, gala or whatever it was, to a digital format, a virtual format, and many of them have had some exceptional success with fundraising, in some cases raising more money than they even had projected through that vehicle. But again, it's getting some, one of our colleagues likes to talk about sizzle, helping spread the word, build some excitement, things like that. So be that ambassador and reach out. One of the areas that's important, and frankly, this category could have gone in any of these 5 slides, is throughout all of this, please try to exhibit emotional intelligence. It's an area that's, more and more of the research highlights the significance of emotional intelligence for leadership effectiveness. And by the way, leadership to me is not the role of the chair or the executive. Every board member is in a leadership role because it ebbs and flows depending on who has the ability, the skills, the time. But every one of us has a sphere of influence. When it comes to emotional intelligence, part of this is like sharing the mic. Do your best to be aware of your impact on others, particularly in the networks. But in the context of your work with your executive director, your chief executive, are you moderating? Are you aware of and moderating or supporting through the relationship with that executive? I've had several people tell me they're very aware of how their effect on people. It's kind of like, well, if you move to step 2, which is, are you actually regulating your behavior to achieve the success or the desired outcome that you're trying to achieve? Helping just motivate others, helping them envision success. It's a critical element of leadership impact. But it's really powerful when an executive feels that they have the support of the board, and the board can envision the organization and the executive succeeding because they're working together and being in touch. They've got each other's back. It's very powerful. The observation I made earlier about a culture of empathy, well, that's explicitly part of emotional intelligence as well. So, take the initiative to brag a bit to your network and highlight the things that are going well. Doesn't have to be big stuff all the time. Again, it's sharing this information, and I say this recognizing full well that there are a lot of days when I fall down on this because I don't think intuitively about social media. I'm just not into that. But by the way, our staff at the Midwest Center has pointed out that as much of a troglodyte as I am, it would really be helpful if I did this more, so I'm working on it. I mentioned this phrase earlier on, and I want to highlight it, and it's a 2-way phrase. It's the theme of be an accountability partner. The executive who literally shared the phrase with me was talking about this a couple of ways. One of the ways was I need partners who will help me be accountable, because if I'm just left sitting here in my corner by myself working on agency stuff, I can get off on a track or something else can go off center. And so I may not even be thinking as critically, positively, but critically about whether I'm on track or not. So I need partners to check in with me, not to be rude, standard bearers, but to be partners in helping me perform effectively as an executive. But by the way, he also pointed out that it'd be really great if his board saw him as an accountability partner. We'll be talking about that next week in our session. But the reality is boards need to be accountable. They need to be partners within themselves to grow, develop, and strengthen their ability to perform, especially during these tough times. And so even hosting a conversation from time to time, are we still providing the leadership support, governance support that is important for the organization at this point in time? The first bullet point on this slide is not new, but it keeps coming up. The percentage of nonprofit executives in America who say they get no feedback of any substance about how well things are going is huge. And it's at best, it's a source of significant anxiety. Sometimes it's actually worse because, of course, they keep wondering when a shoe's going to drop and somebody's going to drop in and say, jump in, digitally or otherwise, and say, you've been screwing up. It's kind of like, well, it would have been nice if you'd let me know when you first thought maybe things were going a little off track. What is it that's going to happen? So, some people think this means just make sure you do a performance appraisal. That's an event. By the way, it's an important event, but if you haven't built up to it, if you haven't worked on performance communication and performance leadership through the year, including especially at these isolating times when maybe it's not as easy to read the body language, the other, interpret the other things that you can if you're in a room together having meetings and interactions. We need to make space for those conversations. So that's really very important. Obviously, it needs to be respectful. The things that you see on the bottom part of the slide are things that we talk about all the time. I know you know these things. We need clear and explicit goals. What is it we're trying to accomplish? But by the way, where this plays into the pandemic environment and the recession environment, maybe the civil unrest and race relationships and all of those important issues as well, is we may have had clear agreements and expectations before, but we may need to go back and affirm or revise those, affirm and revise probably, to stay in touch. Because as an executive, I know we had an agreement a half a year ago that, if we did, that these things are going to be important. But in today's sort of hyper world with these tense situations going on, am I actually, do you still expect that from me? Clearly we've had these conversations happening in some really important and positive ways between executives and funders. Foundations have often, I shouldn't say often, but many of our foundations here and across the country have in fact eased restrictions. They've eased performance dates and other requirements of those sorts. That all requires, however, that we go back and keep each other apprised of, well, this is what's shifted, this is what's not, how are we going to deal with it now? Board members need to know that, but executives do too. And so staying in touch is such a critical issue. And if roles haven't been clarified, stressful times are when it actually throws them further out of whack. And by the way, that accountability partnership includes board self-assessment. We'll do another session on that at another time to share some of the things that are percolating. There are some real great tools that don't cost much or anything. There are some that are expensive too, but assessment and accountability are certainly for the board and its members as well as for the executive. And fifth, one of the things that's a real quirk in the nonprofit world when you compare it to the for-profit world is the nature and form of support for chief executives and their development. I mentioned at the beginning, one of the executives said to me specifically, hey, you know, chief executives are people too. We have fears, we've got insecurities, we're not sure if we're doing stuff right. We need trusted neutrals from the, you know, who are outsiders with whom we can just consult or talk. Sometimes there's development and I need help developing, and so that can be useful as well. So are you investing in executive growth? In the for-profit world, for example, but it's a big example, the topic of executive coaching comes up all the time. And if you are in a typical for-profit organization and your boss or the board says, we think we should invest in an executive coach for you, it's deemed as a very positive sign. They're investing in me, they see potential here, I should grow. Candidly, in too much of the nonprofit world, executive coaching is viewed as an intervention on the way to absolute failure. And we wait until too long if we ever even get to it. And so it's interpreted substantially differently. It's really crazy. Now it is evolving. I'm encouraged to see that. But the point here, you know, even while this is going on, you know, and this isn't mandating, this is offering help. Like, would you find it useful to have an executive coach? Would you like to be involved in this or that executive development program or be a member in this or that organization so you have reference and, you know, outside networks that can support you? But I've just got to say, you know, it connects back to that previous category as well. Executives worry a lot when they just don't get any information. And you know what? I'm sure you have experienced it. We all do. It's kind of like, well, I don't know where I stand with them. But the more you're worried about it, the harder it is to start that conversation from either side. So let's be proactive and reach out and share that. Now, this, you know, this kind of discussion is relevant to the whole staff as well. But so that leads me to, you know, if we're talking about this from the positive side, it's about well-being as opposed to simply are we mitigating damage. But the question I'd invite you to ask yourselves and share insights on, and we'll get to some interaction here in a couple of seconds. You know, how are you doing as a board, as an executive, as an organization, maybe sometimes even as a network? Are you investing enough or any time in actively supporting each other? How's that going? Are we growing a culture of empathy and supporting each other in that way? You know, because we so often think about, and you know, all the things I've been talking about end up making people feel tired. So the question is, well, what are a couple of steps that you could take in the immediate future? You individually as a board member, you individually as a board leader, maybe, you know, next week we'll talk more about executives and what they can do. How might you help move forward the support, the emotional support, as well as the professional and content support that the agency and your chief executive need? I mean, so much of agency performance hinges on effective executive effectiveness. So what do you think? You know, what have you been doing? I'll stop the sharing part here and just invite people to weigh in. You can unmute yourself and just weigh in with a comment or question, or you can you know, type something in the chat room. I don't know if Monica and Cindy, if you've gotten things in the chat room that we should start with.
We did have a really nice thing from Rochelle Parker, Dave. She said that she agreed with you that notes were important. I think you mentioned somewhere along the line, thank you notes, and, you know, to the staff and stuff. And she said, not only that, but she said her board is sending notes to the staff, not just to me, which was really nice. And I love this. So they're also delivering lunch when they're in the office. The board is. So taking it even, so that's kind of nice.
Well, that's taken it to a pretty significant level.
Yeah.
That's impressive to hear. Well, thanks for sharing that.
And this is Rochelle. I did want to share that in general, I feel really, really supported by my board at this moment. And as she just read, they're not just supporting me, they're supporting our entire staff. I mean, we do direct service, and it's, as you can imagine, it's really hard to do direct service right now. Another quick comment, as you talked about professional development, I think there's times where we have to advocate for ourselves. Sometimes our volunteer board members, it's just not on their radar to help us in that arena. And so one of the ways that I do it is I budget for that professional development. And so as we have budget conversations, it's there annually. If something comes up throughout the year, then I'll broach that topic. But I think we have to advocate for ourselves in that regard. And it's not bad, but sometimes it's just not on the radar.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's important. One of the things that I hear in what you're describing, I mean, you've got a more proactive board, and that's very impressive. But it doesn't occur to board members necessarily to think about some of these things, and that's why it is important and useful for us to highlight them. I mean, you know, just sharing some of the PowerPoint from this session or something like that, if it's useful, just trying to put things on their radar. I mean, the average board member still is not very clear. Sometimes they think they're clearer than they are about what is going on inside and where and how to connect. By the way, in the box for the the box where we post the slides for this session in the navigation series, part of the Midwest Center site, there is a discussion worksheet, so to speak. It's actually a table that you might find useful. You take a look at it. It's about role clarification, and particularly as roles are shifting or changing. And so that may or may not be a beneficial tool, but it struck me that it would be worth posting it in case you're interested in it. And if you are interested in other things like those, certainly feel free to reach out, ask for them as well. Other observations and thoughts. By the way, I encourage you to turn your mic or your video on so we can see you. But we don't. If you're that shy or your video's not working, just weigh in. So what do you think? What's Rochelle has shared her situation, and I appreciate that. What's the situation with regard to your organization and your board? Are there ways that that they might move just to take a couple of steps to go further in supporting the organization? By the way, I should have set up a confidential, an anonymous poll, and I didn't think to do that because it would have been interesting just to get everybody on this call to say how effective or strong do you feel your support from your board is, and but it doesn't work as well if I'm asking you to do it by what's appearing on the screen. So.
Dave, Colette brought up the fact that it's kind of hard for boards even to be visible at this time because of the COVID, just, keeping people out of the building. And so just that added challenge to people connecting right now.
Yeah, it's a good point. The thing that worries me about that, because it's so true, is does that mean, okay, you're just kind of okay to be missing in action? And I don't think, Colette, you're arguing for that. But one of the things we may need to think about is, are there different ways, even just in board executive interaction, to make sure that we're staying in the game with each other and all that? Other observations and thoughts?
Andrea Alice Putman appreciated the reminder about the loneliness, isolation, and as a board member to keep that in mind, to not thinking that at times, but to keep that in mind as she serves on boards.
Yeah, thank you.
David, one of the things that I really like about what you've spoken to this morning is you've given me some language that I can use to speak to the board and say, here's a way that you can be helpful right now. I think the board that I'm working with right now is very willing to engage and very willing to be supportive. They just don't often know that it's needed, So,
yeah.
So this is really a nice footprint for me to share with them, of some things that they need to be thinking about. Particularly, we're we're positioning to roll into an executive search later this year. And so this really is a roadmap, you know, of some things that they can be thinking about and working on and preparing for how they can best support the arrival of a new executive director, which is great.
Well, and that's such a pivotal and sensitive time as well. And so, I mean, as with any relationship, how you start off has such a significance for how it grows and develops even before you hit the bumps. So, yeah, it's interesting. I had a couple of executives communicate with me actually in the last few days when they saw the topic of the session and say that they, a couple of them actually had board meetings this morning. And so they said, I can't attend. I've told my board about this, but of course they're supposed to go to the meeting too. Are you going to record this? Well, all of our navigation series sessions are recorded. And so it will be beneficial in some cases. It depends on your relationship with the board, but it may be beneficial to share the link with them and letting people know that this resource is there. It does occur to me now that we're doing this. If you think it's helpful, we could produce a little sort of 2-page written summary that might even be some of the highlights of support of boards supporting executives, and to make it feel like it's not targeted just at boards. We could do the same thing with next week's content on board-centered executive leadership, which is what we'll be doing then. So it's kind of like, let's just talk to both sides of this pivotal relationship. I'm seeing a few heads nod.
I think that would be really helpful.
I'm not happy to give myself additional homework. This is, I'm supposed to be giving other people homework, but when you say this stuff, then it's kind of like, okay, well, put up or shut up. So, okay, we'll do that.
Yeah, that would be appreciated. I think, Dave, people are kind of wondering, how do they get their board to hear this? And, obviously that would be helpful. And this video will be there, so you can always share that with your board and they can watch, the board members can watch this on their own time. So anything else that you want to add on how you can get the board to listen to this information would be helpful, I think, for people. Yeah.
But by the way, it's hard to set this one up, this angle up. I do this with a number of boards, but it's not on a topic quite like this. I will often do a 45-minute to hour presentation on how the changing nature of boards and how they're organized and operating across the country. And that's not like it's a judgmental thing. It's just a report on what's happening across the country. And the benefit of it is you can then say, well, let's share this information about how boards are evolving and changing, how they're changing, organizing, and all that. And then you can, the benefit of that one is we can then shift into a conversation about, well, which of these things is more or less relevant to our board? Which things among these trends and dynamics that we've talked about would be worth it? That's a little more neutral than some boards might perceive this if you shared this. But as a couple of you have highlighted, maybe that a little 1 or 2 page summary of these themes would be food for thought. I will work on, I usually try to do this, but work on trying to couch it in a way that it's not intended to be judgmental so much as let's just remember how we stay in touch.
Dave, a couple people are just wondering about this, who's on this call and stuff, so, and what people on this call think. So Susanna wanted to know if people have changed frequencies of board meetings, and I think a couple people have weighed in on that, but if other people want to offer that, and I don't know if you have information on that, Dave, if people are meeting more frequently now with COVID or not. And then people are just kind of curious about how many people on this call are board members, how many people are EDs, that type of thing. So I don't know if you want to weigh in on that, but there you go.
I'll be glad to offer the quick answer, which is more anecdotal than anything else. And that is that, especially when COVID first kicked in, the virus really hit us. a lot of boards stopped meeting, saying kind of like, well, we got to hunker down and let's just wait and let this play out a bit, and then we'll start meeting again. And the problem is some boards never got around to meeting again. Candidly, one of the things that I think helped was the PPP loan for organizations that thought it might even be relevant. It provided a good excuse with a real time-limited push to get people to even get together and talk with each other. And one of the questions, because it's so variable across different mission categories and all of that, is there something in your operating environment that might make that, might make it positive as well? In general, what I'm hearing anecdotally is that it's really across the board, that a lot of boards are meeting more often or as often, but there's a distinct share of boards that have not met at all. And sometimes it's just they say, well, let's hold off for a week or two beyond what we normally would do, but then you don't reinvigorate the process. And part of this, like a lot of the stuff I mentioned before, that it's a real changing environment. And so what you needed to talk to the board about in March is different from February, is different from April, is different from today. I imagine, many of you, if you've got PPP loans, are going to need to at least be having some basic conversations with your board about what are your accountabilities and requirements that you're going to have to be filing as these things come to close, and you're seeking, as I trust most people are, forgiveness for at least part, if not all, of that loan. But I welcome others talking about, what's made that happen or not happen in your environment.
And just so people know, people are putting some comments up there. So if you're interested in that topic, just, I won't read them, but just people are weighing in on that.
Yeah, it's great. And by the way, I do see that we're at 9:30, so I recognize that. I mean, frankly, thank you for sticking in here. It was great to have as many people as we had joining us for the call. We'll stay on for a few more minutes. If you have individual things you'd like to talk about, and you've got the time, Tuesdays from noon to 1:30, I have the drop-in Zoom office hours, and we can just talk. And I usually get about 3 or 4 people a week who are dropping in. They don't come every week. It's kind of like when something's useful to talk about, then we put it out there. And Mark Culver, I'm sure, has posted the excuse me, the address, the Zoom address for that thing. We'll have to. We're now being required by the university and by Zoom to create a waiting room between you logging in and actually getting into the meeting. But I'll be paying attention. So just go to that normal Zoom connection and it'll tell you, I'll let you in a minute. I did just see one of the chat questions was the address for the drop-in office hours. I don't have that, but Mark, can you post that again?
It's about 4 comments above.
There it is.
Lisa, just look up about 4 comments, and it's right there.
Well, I'm seeing now, and Mark just posted a chat item, so it should be on the thing that just came up again. All right. Well, let me tell you, thank you very much for joining us for today's session. Next week, of course, we'll be picking up with the other side of this relationship and talking about how do boards support, how do executive directors support their boards, and I have some information about some really useful research that some of my colleagues have done on that topic as well. So I look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you for joining us today.